Well, welcome to Tech Talks. I'm really excited to have Anthony and Sheryl here from Buildable Approvals, and today's topic is all about building classifications. So welcome to Tech Talks. It's great to have you here. Let's start from the start. Like what are classifications? Does every structure and every building have a classification?
Yes.
We tend to see, there's obviously a mixed range for residential and commercial purposes. Your residential fall within class 1 to 10. So, primarily your houses, your sheds, your carports, patios, those sort of things. Volume 1, it comprises of all your commercial classifications, so your 2 to 9. So that's where you'll start looking at things like, your warehouses, your units, shops, offices, and so forth.
So to find the classifications, you go to the National Construction Code, and you said there's volume 1 and volume 2. So in volume 2, you have the commercial.
Volume 2 is your residential, class 1s and 10s.
And so let's just break that down a little bit more. So when you say class 1 and 10s, there's class 1A, class 1B, and then there's class 10A and 10B. Did you just want to...
And 10C.
10C,
but
yes.
We don't really deal with the bushfire shelters up here
at
all, so that's why we can forget.
So did you want to just talk a little bit about what a class 1A is and what a class 1B is?
So a class 1A is your normal dwelling house, whereas for single occupancy, like for one family, class 1B is more boarding house, but in a very small range. So not a class 3, which is for a larger. I think it's under 300 is what can you at 1B. So you've still then got access, which you don't have those requirements for a 1A. Do you want to screw on that one?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think, for a 1B, there's a lot more limitations, I guess, as to what they can utilise in that sort of structure. So it's limited to a number of occupants, number of rooms, square meterage. And then, it does sort of tie back into your volume 1 for your AS 1428 compliance, where you've got to consider access into the building, navigating around the building, PWDs, car parking, all that sort of stuff.
So class 1As can be single unit dwellings, townhouses.
Correct.
So they're attached with the firewall. And class 1Bs, boarding houses, usually on the same level, or up to 300 square metres. So class 10s, so you got 10A and 10B and 10C. What's the difference?
So a 10A carports, your patios, your garages, and domestic outbuildings, so sheds. Whereas a 10B is your swimming pool, your retaining walls, and like I said, 10C is your bushfire shelters. We do a lot of 10As and Bs. I've never yet done a 10C.
Great.
Yeah, they are interesting. We've had one proposed, I can recall, where they wanted to do an underground bunker. So trying to come up with a classification for that, I think the closest thing that we could sort of consider was potentially a bushfire shelter. Being that, I guess it was underground and it was only really way to define it as some sort of building classification.
So volume 2 of the NCC is class 1s and 10s, and then volume 1 of the NCC is 2 to 9. So, and there's no class 11s, 12s, it's all between 1 and 10.
Many.
Not that I've come across.
Special structures?
There are special structures.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't have a class.
No.
So that's governed by the legislation, so you'll find that in the building regs where they define special structure.
Great, awesome. So within Buildable Approvals, what type of classification work are you dealing with mostly in your job, Sheryl?
I do class 1 and class 10, so I'm in the residential team, which is your pools, your dwellings, your sheds, carports, secondary dwellings. So
secondary dwellings, I'd say that's a hot topic at the moment.
Yes, they're very popular.
Yes. How are you finding, like you'd think being two classifications, class 1, class 10, that'd be quite simple, but it's not, is it? Like you're finding, are people misinterpreting the classifications, especially in class 1s?
Yeah, they do. A lot would like to have secondary dwelling underneath the main house, which then, both being single occupant units or occupancy units, they need to have their own bathrooms, kitchens, laundries. So then if you have another one underneath and they want to rent it out, it becomes class 2. But explaining that to people that want it is very difficult. The other thing is too, having your dwelling and then your secondary dwelling, it still needs fire separation. And a lot of the times they want to join them together and just not have the firewall. So yeah, it can be challenging at times.
And Anthony, you manage the commercial and residential teams in Buildable Approvals.
Yeah.
So how are you seeing classifications and the importance of classifications in the commercial space?
Yeah, so I think, as Sheryl touched on, we obviously have that misunderstanding between what a class 1 and class 2 building looks like. Even people who are wanting to do alterations to an existing unit, in their mind, they've got this idea that, yep, it's a residential building, it's just a class 1 building, but they're not sort of aware that, once they're sort of stacked on top of one another, it does sort of change the way in which we look at that and defined by the NCC. So that's probably a challenge in the commercial space that we often see, because that volume 1 obviously comes with a lot more requirements around fire protection provisions and egress and all that in those type of buildings.
We know at the moment that with the housing shortage, there's a lot of people wanting to put granny flats, secondary dwellings, tiny homes, whatever you want to call them. With those, do they fall into a class 1 category? And what do they need to do to make sure they're a class 1 and not like a boarding house or?
So yeah, they do fall into a class 1. You still have to have your fire separation between them, and that's the biggest thing we find. Like quite often we might get a application in and they've done some alterations and they've been picked up for renting out by council legally, because they've got the bottom, they've had a 2-story and they've decided to just cut the access off between.
Oh yes.
Yeah, get rid of the stairs or whatever, or lock it off, and then rent out the bottom and rent out the top, and they put kitchens, everything. So it becomes a class 2, not a class 1. And we often can't approve them because it's not zoned.
Yes, true. So that's where it falls under the planning scheme. It might be zoned for residential purposes, but when we talk about residential, like more class 1 use, and if it goes to a class 2, that really falls into a commercial zoning.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And also with that, it's fire set. So if you've got a 2-story house and they've just changed it and put, plastered whatever, there's no fire set, and it's almost impossible to retrofit fire separation between 2 levels.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think it's important that, when we're taking on these applications, we're really engaged with our clients. So we're trying to understand, what are they trying to get out of this? Obviously there's ways that we can come up with, alternatives to getting their desired outcome. Some of them don't necessarily want to, separate and lease them out or rent them out on an individual basis. They're more so looking to have family members sort of stay. So there's that line between defining it as an extension to a dwelling as opposed to a secondary dwelling, and that really comes down to the facilities that are within each of those buildings. So, say they're putting a detached structure in the backyard and it just consists of a bedroom, a kitchenette, doesn't have a laundry facility, you can't actually then go define that as a sole occupancy unit, a single class 1A building. Therefore, we can look at that as a detached extension.
Yes.
It kind of ticks their box. So I think it's important to understand what the client's actually wanting to achieve.
Great, that's right. How does it work for you guys and for our listeners to understand as certifiers, like how important the classification of buildings is when you're doing your assessment, and how that determines where you go to assess the plans through the legislation?
So I'd say straight away, when you open up a set of plans, you can tell, by looking at it, whether it's a class 1 or a class 2. it's very important because it comes down to your fire safety, your access and egress for people to be able to get in and out. Whereas with the class 1 over the class 2, you don't need that. You have your normal smoke alarms, but you don't have a certain path of travel or anything like that. You don't have you have the livable housing design standard now, but you certainly don't have AS 1428. So there's a big difference.
Yeah, so like you could chop this. Yeah, in the commercial world, obviously, we sort of look at we're involved potentially early on in the design stage, so really understanding what the intended use is of that building. Obviously, volume 1 carries a lot more requirements around fire safety provisions for occupants, because, you know, say you're looking at something like a class 2 building, which is traditionally like apartments units, where, you know, there's high potential for occupants. So it's managing the way to ensure the safety measures are applicable. You know, occupants are sleeping, so you need detection systems, early methods of triggering them in the event that there's a fire. Whereas, you know, your office buildings as a class 5, occupants are alert, their day-to-day activity. So I guess fire safety provisions are a lot less than something of a class 2 building. But you sort of get a grasp of the nature of works based on the plan submission that's provided to you.
Do you often see mixed use classes in buildings? Commercial is probably more so. Correct. Where you've got like retail, you might have car parking underneath, retail, and then apartments. But in residential, do you see mixed uses?
Well, the only mixed use is your class 1 and your class 10, which is your dwelling, and then your garage or your pool and shed. So not as such where on the scale of commercial. And the difference, I guess, with the class 1 and 10 together is the garage part can be on the boundary, but you have your 60 firewall if it's on the boundary, and then the rest of the house is set back at least 900. Normally they're 1.5 to comply with your QDC requirements for siding.
I think it's important to be able to try and capitalise on those different classifications. You know, that way clients can get the most of their desired outcomes with construction.
So with classification, from my understanding, it all comes back to the intended use. So what's your advice to designers, architects, or even mum and dads who have a project coming up and they around the classification and the intended use early with the certifier?
I'd say definitely find out what the intended use is and make sure that what they're drawing is to that intended use. We often find that we'll get a set of plans in and they'll show some things but not others, and then when you actually get out there and you ask the questions and you say, right, it's not to be used as a secondary dwelling, or you've got toilets, shower, kitchenette in the shed, it's still going to be used for a shed. And then by the time you get out to do a final, because sometimes they don't ring for it, and it could be a year or 2 later, you get out there, it's fitted, it's fully decked out, there's a bed in there, it's not quite a kitchenette, or even if it is, it has cooking facilities, it becomes a class 1, and we can't sign them off.
Yes.
It needs to go back in, be reassessed, and then to try and retro approve is very difficult.
Yeah, especially with like moisture coming up through the slab, if they need to put down all that, obviously the barriers there, the energy efficiency.
There's also the fact that for a shed, you need to have the final inspection. It's not mandatory to have a footing, slab, frame. The trouble is, if you go out and it's the only one you're doing, and it's final, and it has been lined, and everything's been done, and it's not had any other inspection, how do you know what's...
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to retro.
So if their long-term intended use is for it to be a secondary dwelling,
Get it approved that way in the beginning.
Get it approved that way in the beginning, so that all the construction systems and methods can be done for a class 1,
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Because basically, if it's not done that way, and we've approved as a shed, and they've made it into a dwelling, then we can either disengage or lapse that approval too. So then they're in a worse spot than what they would have been if they got it done for the intended use.
Yeah. For commercial, Anthony, is it getting involved with the designers and the architects really early in the stage to understand? Because the difference between a class could be massive to do with like fire installations. So yeah, what's your advice there? And when should the certifier get involved?
Yeah, look, I think we're tending to see ourselves get involved more in that concept schematic design stage, because obviously we can understand the use of the building and then provide a compliance report around what they need to consider as the key fundamentals. When you start looking at commercial buildings, you look at the type of construction, there's rise in stories, effective building height, all those warrant and trigger different requirements based on the type of classification they're applying. So, that allows for more fire safety installations, the bigger the scale of the building. So I think being part of that process, providing or identifying to the client what they need to, the design limitations, hopefully, the intent of that is to provide a more streamlined certification process when we're to approval stage.
I thought a good one could be possibly fit outs, how it's been fitted out for a certain, could be like office, and then the next tenant comes in and they're like, oh no, now we want to use it as, we're going to clear this out and turn it into a shop. Yeah, so just things like that where people may not have thought that yes, that actually needs certification.
But it's also planning.
Could be planning regulated
planning.
also.
Yeah, I had it was just meant to be like a warehouse, and they changed the use of that to actually being a teaching facility.
Like a tutor.
It was a tit for tat situation.
Yeah.
It was so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was at Caboolture, and it was nasty.
Yeah.
So both of them end up about 200 grand out of pocket.
Oh man. Yeah.
And it was over car parking.
Oh really?
Because the
that's
warehouse
right. Yeah.
wasn't meant to take up so much. So car park, everything comes in.
Once you start changing the use of something, especially in the commercial world, it can definitely have implications.
So with commercial fit outs, if you've been approved as an office like this, and then that tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in and wants to use it for gym, coffee shop, whatever, if it's not the same intended use as what was approved as a office, that's certification and maybe planning?
Correct.
Yeah, both.
Both, yeah. And is that because of things like car parking or
It's car parking, it's fire, it's, it brings in so many things. So it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
But it triggers.
Fundamentally, it will require a full assessment to be able to identify what all the triggers are for that potential change in use.
Yeah, there was one, I think it was out here at this industrial estate up the road, and it's pure factories, and the tenant who was looking to lease or buy that property wanted it into a 24-hour gym, and so that the planners had to look at it, and then they were like, oh, this may not be approved because it then becomes 24/7. They want a 24/7 gym, which means car parking, and it was in an area where it was more limited to manufacturing between certain hours. So yeah, there's so many different.
A lot of avenues to consider when you're going down that pathway.
That's right. Even the pop-up coffee shops.
Yeah, it's certainly not just about finding a cheap building, commercial building, and thinking you can use it for anything.
Yeah.
And that is a problem.
Yes.
We see that a lot in even warehouses, like, even adding minor additions that, people will have a warehouse, they'll go throw in a mezzanine.
Yeah.
In their mind, they're just creating a little bit of storage space, but not understanding the implication that has on compartment limitations, egress distance, for your travel, potential coverage for special fire services.
Yes.
So I think it's important that if you're not certain and you're going ahead to do some building work, call a certifier. get it clarified.
Yeah.
It'll save you a world of hurt.
Definitely ask the question, always ask the question.
Always ask the question. So Anthony, this one's for you. What's the most common classification that you think has the most complex compliance issues?
They all come with their complexities, I guess. The ones that we're probably more mindful are of your childcares and your hospital buildings. Obviously, with the exposure and the nature of the buildings that they're associated with, there's a lot more provisions that need to be considered for fire safety elements.
Good. Well, let's do rapid fire. So we're going to go through from class 1 to class 10. Sheryl, you can kick it off and go class 1 to 5 and just and share with our listeners what in a quick summary, what they are.
Okay, so your class 1 is your dwelling houses, so your single occupant units, so your dwelling house, your secondary dwellings. Your class 2 is your unit buildings. Class 3 is transient living, so your aged care, boarding house on a grander scale, things like that. Class 4 is when you have a caretaker or a dwelling within another classification, so your mixed use. And class 5, your office buildings.
Anthony, 6 to 10.
Yep, so class 6 is obviously your retail, shops, restaurants. Class 7 is broken up into 2 classifications, 7A, 7B. So they comprise of car parks and obviously like your industrial type setups. Class 8 is in like full industrial, where you got factories, workshops and processing. Class 9 also broken into separate classifications. You got 9A, B and C. Your 9A are your hospitals, nursing homes. 9B are schools, cinemas, childcare centres. And your 9C is your residential aged care buildings. Finally, class 10, also broken down, 10A, 10B, 10C. So your 10As are your garages, your patios, your sheds. Your 10B are your retaining walls and swimming pools, and 10C are your bushfire shelters.
Great. Well, thank you, Sheryl and Anthony, for coming on Tech Talks. It's been fantastic to hear your wisdom and guidance and your learnings from all things building classifications. If anyone's needing more advice, feel free to reach out to Anthony and Sheryl from Buildable Approvals, and we look forward to sharing more technical information with you guys on the next Tech Talks episode.